Hello, everyone. Hey, let's go ahead and get started with one. Thank you all for taking your time out of your day to be here with us. We've got a great turnout. We've got a great program. So thrilled to have you here. My name is Marcus Scrim. I'm a marketing strategist here at Ascendle. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, which is about minimum viable tech. Today's program is a conversation between Dave Todaro, the CEO and founder of Ascendle, and Jeremy Jackson, the CTO of the Alpine Software Group. Now, before we begin the presentation, I want to remind you that we will be running a live Q&A toward the end of the webinar. We have enabled the Q&A feature, which is located in the Zoom controls on your screen. I'm sure you know where they are. Please feel free to submit those questions at any time during the presentation. Certainly, you can also click on the like button to upvote your favorite questions as well. Also, as a special treat today, as you leave the webinar, you will be asked to participate in a short survey about today's presentation. Obviously, we'd love your feedback so that we can better develop future content. And as you probably guessed, if you miss anything in today's presentation, don't worry. We will email you a link to this webinar recording along with the slide deck. Well, let's get started with the introductions on this one. Our host today is probably someone that you know well. That's Dave Todaro, the founder and CEO of Ascendle. For the last 35 years, Dave has been a technology leader involved in all aspects of product vision, software engineering, and entrepreneurship. Now, our guest today is Jeremy Jackson. Jeremy Jackson is the group CTO at the Alpine Software Group. He is responsible for scaling people, process, and tech across 30 plus engineering teams and setting the technical direction at ASG as they go by. Now, previously, Jeremy worked at UCaring, which is an Alpine company acquired by GoFundMe in 2018. And before that, he spent time building large corporate and government websites, some that you've probably heard of, monster.com, cms.gov, medicare.gov, and yes, he even had the pleasure of getting pulled into healthcare.gov to help right the ship when it first launched back in 2012, ensuring millions of Americans received affordable healthcare. Now, before we get started, please allow me a moment to introduce you to Ascendle. For those of you who don't know us, Ascendle is a leader in custom software development. We partner with companies as their full service development team to create mobile and web applications to drive their business goals. We offer web, app, and platform development, along with product strategy and product design as well. Here are just a few of our clients. As you can see, we work with a wide variety of organizations, from some of those early stage startups all the way to some of the largest companies in the world. And we wrote the book, or as I like to say, Dave actually wrote the book. Dave Todaro spent 2 years to capture everything we know about agile development, and in 2019 published the 500-page Epic Guide to Agile. And speaking of Dave, well, it's time to welcome him and Jeremy to the program, and let's get started with one. This one is going to be a ton of fun. Now, Dave, when we learned Jeremy Jackson was willing to come onto the program today, I thought I was excited, but then I think you were even more excited. Why is that?
Well, Jeremy is one of those guys that you just love to meet. I met Jeremy about 3 years ago. We've done a few different projects together since then. And Jeremy is one of the smartest guys I've ever met and one of the nicest guys I've ever met. So super excited to welcome him onto the program. He is a very busy guy with all those companies that Marcus was mentioning, trying to keep them all aligned and moving forward. And very appreciative that he's taken some time with us today. So let me hand over the microphone to Jeremy and have him introduce himself as well as Alpine Software Group.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me today. So my name is Jeremy Jackson. Again, I'm the group CTO at ASG. ASG is a software acquisition platform. We like to think of ourselves as buying, building, and bolstering industry-leading SaaS companies. To date, we've made over 33 acquisitions in 7 verticals and have 750 employees across all of our companies. And now, while I'd like to take credit for a lot of these numbers I've shared here on the left, 2 million in R&D saved, $1 million in cloud costs, 5 cloud migrations in the last year, really all the credit goes to my CEOs, CTOs, and engineering teams at these companies. They deserve accolades for all these amazing achievements. Today, I get the privilege of really sharing that strategy that was used to drive some of these improvements, and I'm honored to speak with you today. But let's jump in. What is minimum viable technology? So if we go to the next slide, it's interesting. MVT is actually baked off of a framework called Well-Architected Framework by AWS. And if I think about it, I'd wager everyone on this call has some MV star strategy, right? It's usually framed as what good enough looks like for your company. And at the end of the day, I've tried many different strategies as well to measure and baseline an organization, only to find many of those strategies were highly subjective, really resulting in qualitative, not quantitative outcomes. And so a couple of years back, I'm at an AWS summit and I stumble across this presentation on well-architected framework. And it dawned on me, here is a industry standard framework with a self-service toolkit and a web-based assessment that works for both cloud and non-cloud workloads alike. And the kicker is there's consultants, representatives, AWS and Azure folks that can actually help you roll this out as well. So I decided to put this into action. And for me, I was surprised early on the degree of accuracy it predicted in operational maturity and cloud readiness. And after a few at-bats, we really decided to roll this out across our portfolio and iterate on the improvements that we got out of the report. If you go to this next slide, this is not a presentation on well-architected framework. This is a presentation on MVT, because the rub with well-architected framework, while it's very in-depth and robust, and it'll give you a 40, 50 page readout on a bunch of improvements you can do, well, no one reads a 40 and 50 page readout on improvements. So what we tried to do over the years is really just synthesize down to first principles in engineering. What are the key things you need to be doing as an organization to drive readiness, to drive your business maturity? And when we think about it, it's really simplifying it down to these 5 things: getting code out, not getting hacked, staying up, improving CNPS, and keeping costs down. And what we encourage our engineering leaders to think about is take that last pillar, cost optimization, which is not often thought about when improving the tech stack, and use that to incentivize the other pillars. In this way, you're able to reduce the cost of operating while driving operational maturity within your teams. And so for us, this is the key unlock, is really using the framing of well-architected framework, applying this MVT lens, and then figuring out how you can scorecard that.
So Jeremy, I think some of us are familiar with all of these concepts, but can you talk a little bit about CNPS? I'm not sure if all of us have heard that term before.
Yeah, so CNPS translates to customer NPS. And so one of the things I try and do with engineering teams is have them speak to outcomes, not initiatives. The initiative is, hey, we drove our performance time from 5 seconds to sub-second. But if you read the literature out there from Google and others, what you're really doing is you're improving your customer NPS, because they're staying on the page. They're not jumping off the page sooner because the page renders quickly. They have good user experience. They're able to actually interact with the application. And for us, what I try and translate, and that's part of what I'll share, is not just what are the technical benchmarks that we could be using, but what are the outcomes we're affecting in the business? What are the metrics that we can measure as a downstream result of this MVT framework?
That's fantastic. So it sounds like when we were talking about this offline, that you've taken these concepts and you've actually put in some numbers and some metrics to it. And I think that's what you're going to talk about next.
Yeah, so it's a good segue. What you see here below is a scorecard, a sample set of our companies and kind of their initial baseline maturity when they came into our organization. And how we create this is we run the well-architected framework, and we take all those open high-risk items in each pillar, and we divide that by the total number of questions and turn that into a percentage. That makes that kind of qualitative readout in the WAF framework a quantitative metric that we can use. And our version of good at ASG is, let's not try and get 100% of these best practices. Let's, as a group, align around 70% of industry best practices that we think are pivotal to creating a sustainable business. And for us, that's our NVT score. It's 70% of industry best practices vectored across these 5 different pillars. And one thing you'll notice is, oftentimes a lot of our companies on the onset are coming in with pretty low tech maturity. And if you click one more time, what you'll see is the green represents kind of the baseline improvement just after a quarter of continuous work against MVT. So our goal is not to go from 40 to 100 overnight. This is a multi-year roadmap over time. Our goal is to help our companies incrementally improve and get to that MVT score over, a multi-year period.
Jeremy, I know you're going to dig into some specific examples and dive a little bit deeper, but just from a high level across these companies, what's sort of the big takeaway for you? What have you seen as you guys have focused on this MVT and allowed that to, seems like it's one of those, what gets measured gets managed. Can you just tell us anecdotally at a high level, what have you seen as a result?
Yeah, well, anecdotally, I think, what we're seeing is the companies that get there are winning. Ultimately, all of our companies that are above that 70% benchmark are seeing high growth, high sustainability. Oftentimes that translates to improved output, better security or less security issues coming in, and better ability to pivot for the unforeseen. And this last year was a testament to that, with COVID really impacting market dynamics, rapidly changing the roadmap and the prioritization and effort of the team. So some of the examples I'll share in a bit here really talk about how we used the maturity that was driven through MVT to help kind of pivot businesses as different things came up.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're all thinking, man, now this all sounds really great, but where do I start? And that's where I encourage you guys to run your workload through either the AWS or Azure well-architected framework tools online just to get a read. But as I said, what you're going to get is this 40, 50-page report. And oftentimes what I found our engineering leaders saying is, okay, great, now what? Where do I go from here? And what we try to do is then translate each of those pillars into some table stake items you can do along the way on a multi-year roadmap. And that's what this looks like. This is our MVT roadmap. What we say is first is obviously baseline. Run that MVT, figure out some basic KPIs you want to affect and the outcomes you're trying to shape in your business. And oh, by the way, find some cost savings that'll get you there. Then drive insights, reliability, scalability, and maturity. And maturity is really that promised land that you might hear many of your engineers speak to. I want to go to full containerization, full CI/CD, have everything in a data lake, and have everything cost controlled, and that's all well and good. But oftentimes you can't jump from step 1 to step 5. You kind of have to, again, increment as you go. So what this represents is a way to take the lensing of the well architecture framework, the report, and our MVT, and apply it in a multi-year context so that you can get the best possible success for your business.
Looks great, Jeremy, but a lot of the companies that we work with, they kind of come to me and say, you know what, we struggle a little bit with the basics. We're not even getting onto this map yet. We still struggle a little bit with our development team, or we're struggling to adopt Agile and just produce a high quality product iteration after iteration. Are there folks that are sort of, off the left-hand side of this? And in that case, what do you do with those companies?
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective. And as I said, many of our companies early on that are in that 40, 50% of industry best practices are really right there, right? They maybe have some agile process, but I'd label it more Scrum or Fall. And maybe they have some of these tech maturity levels, but aren't really there on the whole gamut. So what I encourage them to do is first baseline and think about KPIs you can affect, and then start to implement the basic processes, insights you need to really make that effective. So examples of that are at this stage, starting to have a metric for test coverage or unit test coverage. Even if it isn't fully automated, you have a degree of awareness of how much of your application is covered. Then start to move towards continuous integration, not full CI/CD, but an ability to start to get your code and your development deliverables in order and be able to eventually deploy them here, maybe into a blue-green deployment or into multiple infrastructure deployments. But those are the table stake things that you kind of have to front load and do at the early stage when you're trying to do baselines and get some insights on your velocity and deliverables. And then you can always iterate and improve from there.
Got it. So get the basics taken care of, and then you can get on to this high-level plan.
Yep.
Perfect.
Well, great. What I thought I'd do today, instead of just giving you a theory, is go share some reality. What are some before and after stories within our portfolio that this strategy helped drive, and what are some tangible examples of what we did with it? So the first example I'll give you is one of our applications. It's a video-heavy mobile app. The problem statement there is they had accelerated storage costs and decreased revenue coming out of COVID. And so as a team, they were kind of forced to reevaluate their spend and their hosting and how their workloads were managed. So before, their primary customers were rental car equipment centers and heavy equipment centers, all of course impacted by COVID. They were a mobile app with kind of atypical AWS usage, so low compute but high storage costs and high transfer costs. And then their daily spend was about $600 per day, which I know sounds pretty low generally, but as you add that up, it gets pretty expensive. So their goal on the onset was, how do we reduce costs so that we can keep the same operating margin even at reduced revenue? And what I love about this team is they started with the insights. They started with the key metrics that they needed to affect: total cost of ownership, CAC to LTV for customers. But what they did is they lensed it. What metrics matter to our business? And in our business, it was cost per inspection. So they really started to identify, tag their workloads, and figure out, what do I need to affect to actually drive savings? In their case, they pulled a couple of levers that were all right out of the well-architected framework. One was to reduce spend by 30% by implementing savings plans. Another was to use intelligent tiering, or a way to structure the data, which saved another 50%. And then they also looked at usage, which this wasn't in the WAF, but it was something that they got as a downstream antidote, which is, when they examined their customer base, they realized most customers actually don't use data older than a year, but they were keeping videos, images from 7 years back. And so what they decided to do is actually move all that work to something called Glacier Archive, which drastically reduced the savings on that part of the storage to almost 90%. The end result is they were able to actually drive their daily spend down 50% to $300 a day, and really bring that business back within a healthy margin, so that, didn't have to worry about laying folks off or cutting other costs in the business. We were able to right size the business when it was needed. So on the slide before, I won't go into the technical details, but what you're seeing in the next slide here is effectively just that, what the AWS billing console looks like after hitting these savings levers, and some of the specific line items of that bill on what metrics we're able to save on, and what that looked like after pulling all these levers.
So it seems like, even though this company really needed to respond to COVID and the changing business, it seems like a lot of these things just make sense maybe for any company, taking a hard look at, well, how are we using storage? Like your example, are we saving some things in active storage that aren't being accessed for years and years? Is there some concept with the MVT in terms of low-hanging fruit, that sort of the obvious things you might want to hit on right away?
Yeah, definitively. And so that's where I think one of the reasons we put that roadmap together is some of the easiest low-hanging fruit you can pick right away is finding found money, like offsetting costs, things that'll help incentivize the rest of the work you need to do. In this case, yeah, we found the cost, but I'll show you in a minute here where we reinvested those savings into other spend items that we needed to get done for the business. But yeah, that's one of the reasons we put that roadmap together, is something like a savings plan is thing one you do on a business to help really drive some immediate savings and give you some found money to play with.
Awesome, thank you.
So this next application, I'm sure is near and dear to many of you, which is an aging application in the government sector that we had to think about a rebuild. And so in this case, it was an aging architecture for a government-based transportation management system. And it was causing the company to lose customers and lose out on RFPs. Before, 30-second page load times, classic ASP, Oracle database, infrastructure that was co-load on a local data center, and kind of legacy Windows servers. And the goal was pretty simple. Let's create an MVP, or a product in the cloud that could win new business. And this team is actually quite remarkable. Like, in a span of 6 months, went from 30-second page load times to sub-second page load time, fully modernized microservice stack, an infrastructure that has all the key tenets you look for in that pillar 5, 100% cloud, 5 nines uptime, containerized auto-scaling, CI/CD. So the answer is, and the outcome was they won. It's fully cloud-enabled product, scaling agile operations, and what they did really unlocked rapid development and customer onboarding for their specific company. And how I look at that through the lens of MVT is this next slide here. When we first baselined this organization under the existing architecture stack, they were sub 40, sub 50% of industry best practices. After going through this rebuild, getting this MVP out to market, getting an alpha customer, a beta customer, and then rebaselining several quarters later, what you'll see is they're almost at 90% of industry best practices. And that's really telling. And what you see are huge performance gains and huge efficiency gains in terms of the output of the workload and the architecture they were able to build. And so that's something we use as a leading indicator to really help our companies measure the success ahead of really, the long tail, which is the revenue and things that'll come.
So Jeremy, a lot of the folks that we talk to are asking us about this specific problem, which is, I've got this legacy application. I'm trying to figure out if I should stick with it or if I should, work with a company like Ascendle to do a clean sheet rebuild. That usually is a pretty daunting decision and conversation. Okay, I've got this huge amount of work from the last 5, 10, 15, however many years it might be. This idea of, starting from scratch, do I really want to do that? Can you provide any sort of guidance around, the thought process? What's the tipping point to make that decision around, all right, you know what, we are going to take a clean sheet approach, contemporary cloud architecture, contemporary technology. And I mean, we can see the results here, but if you're on the front end of that decision, how do you kind of run that calculus?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the tipping point varies depending on the age of architecture, how long you've been there. But oftentimes what you're going to start to see is a degradation in service or a degradation in this case of business outcomes. You're losing RFPs, you're seeing customer churn, like things are really starting to impact the business negatively. So you're forced to make a choice. And for us, I work in PE, there's the magic 3-letter word, which is ROI. We have to go examine what is the ROI on a rebuild, on what is the net new TAM or market segment that we could go after with this rebuild. And that's what kicks off this initiative. But as you know, having done many rebuilds, Dave, I'm sure that is a long tail effort and revenue comes, but it's further down the pipeline. So how do you sustain momentum? And what the hard part is not getting people to align on the rebuild and starting the rebuild. It's sustaining momentum against the rebuild and continuing the investment when you don't have any good indicators of success. And so that's what MVT really does for you. It becomes your leading indicator for success on, hey, yeah, we don't have revenue yet because this thing's still an MVP, or maybe we just got one customer, but we are able to definitively show when we go to market, we have hit 90% of industry best practices. We are a bleeding edge or at least leading edge technology platform that will be competitive in this space. And if you've done all the other things right with your rebuild plan, figured out the right customer segment you're going to enter with, figure out how you stair step and build up for an MVP, I think you're going to see success. And how I frame that for my CEOs is you want to be in the business of installing smoke alarms, right? Where there's smoke, there's usually fire. And that's what you start to see with legacy applications. Start monitoring them, start figuring out when you're starting to see degradation. And eventually it's going to get hot enough that you're going to have to make that choice. And the question is, once you make that choice, how do you sustain the engineering effort? How do you ensure outcomes and have gating mechanisms that ensure you're making progress along the way?
Yeah, I really liked what you said about the leading indicator part, because there's a lot of faith involved, right? Especially from the business, kind of looking at the engineering team. And even if the engineering team is delivering in an agile fashion and an incremental product is showing up every 2 weeks, usually the revenue and the real change will be lagging behind that. So I like that how this framework provides that leading indicator of, look, we are making progress. We can see this contrast in terms of the before and the after. And we know that if we set our table right, the revenue will follow.
Right. So I'll share one more example with you. This is a HIPAA compliant web app, and this speaks to those trade-offs I mentioned. So this was another case as a byproduct of COVID where we saw kind of increased demand of government agencies going virtual overnight. That really caused us to evaluate two things, really evaluate our hosting and figure out how we get more secure and compliant and cost effective at the same time. So as you can imagine, and I'm sure many of you in this case, originally we were in a managed hosting provider with fixed capacity. We had bought servers several years ago. They had limited observability, so no real way of telling when we're going to hit that upper bound on the servers. And there were full scope security requirements. This is a HIPAA compliant government web app, so there needed to be pretty secure workloads. So the goal, at a high level is pretty simple: move to the cloud, improve security. What we found after doing the MVT and after doing this workload is we're actually able to do both. We found cost efficiencies by leveraging auto scaling and smaller servers in the cloud, which saves us about 120K annual in hosting costs. And then we're able to take the shared responsibility of the model, which put simply just says AWS, Azure will manage the servers, you manage the security of the application, and then use those savings to drive a security firm to help us with HIPAA best practices on the application. And so that allowed us to have our cake and eat it too with security. And then in the next slide, you'll see how we kind of measure that along the way. Again, similar thing where it was a kind of a monolithic on-prem infrastructure to start, so like sub 40% of industry best practices. We immediately moved to improve security before putting it into the cloud, which drove those HIPAA best practices. Moved it into the cloud and then optimized the workload in the cloud once we got there, which drove 120K in annual savings. And so, and then eventually drove additional improvements in there once we're in the cloud. So quarter over quarter, you see substantive improvement in each of these pillars. And what I mentioned before is it's all about how you make those opportunistic trade-offs. We didn't just find money and then let that go and go back to the business. We found that money and reinvested it back into an area of the business we needed.
That's a good point, Jeremy. Are there any tips you can give, leaders to make sure that that money does get earmarked to get reinvested as opposed to getting siphoned off to some other area of the business?
Yeah, it's always tricky, and of course, every situation is different. For me, I like to think about framing. So what I tell my engineering leaders is to think about, one, estimating what's the level of savings, like playing out the movie before you even get started. So we did a cost estimation tool. We started to figure out how we can move this like for like workload over and then reduce cost, get a ballpark earmark cost on what that was, and have that in our back pocket. Then we said, hey, we have this real challenge and problem around security. And so what I can guarantee, having been in a lot of board meetings, is if you come into a board meeting with just the challenge, you're going to be met with a lot of stern faces. But if you come into a board meeting with, here's the challenge, here's how we're going to solve it, and by the way, here's how we're going to self-fund it, well, you're just going to get head nods. Everyone's going to be aligned with that. And so for me, it's all about setting it up properly and creating the framing such that you allow yourself the ability to have, a well-executed plan that already speaks to the offsetting costs. So those don't get taken away when you need them most.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right, so I've given you a lot of examples of things that we used across our portfolio. Let me give you kind of the lessons learned here, because that's always where I get the most value, the scrape knee stories and just ways to think about it. I think, Dave, you mentioned it's always good to measure, iterate, improve, measure twice, cut once. And that's true here. You can't fix what you can't see. Technology is so wide and varying. It's hard to get a metric on it and hard to get some sort of a quantifiable improvement that you can sustain and look after quarter. So for us, that's how we're using MVT. It's a way to, it's that Kaizen method. It's a way to measure, iterate, improve quarter after quarter, year after year across a portfolio, an enterprise, a set of business units. And it's something that without it, I would be just putting my thumb up in the air and guessing where the wind's going in terms of how we're doing as a business. And with it, I can feel confident we're making sustained progress. And it's kind of a tide rises all boats strategy to improving a portfolio like this. The other learning, I think, is there are no silver bullets. Like even our MVT framework is inherently flawed. With technology, it's an ever-changing goalpost, right? What is true today is not true tomorrow. There's going to be new services, new technology that make any recommendation given today obsolete tomorrow. So what I try and focus on is not, is MVT the solve all, but more, is MVT a good starting point? Is it a lingua franca that we can use across organizations, across executives to rally around a common need to just make sustained improvement, drive metrics and KPIs forward, and win as a group? And I think you start that by defining what is your NV star for your organization? What is your minimum viable, maturity level that you're looking to instill across your team or across your tech stack? And that's your, starting point. But it's not a silver bullet. It takes a lot of work. And as you saw with each of these instances, wasn't overnight. It was multi-quarters, multi-years in. And I love this saying. It's attributed to a couple different people, but to finish first, you must first finish. I'd be lying if I said we got it right the first time. We didn't. Again, I tried a bunch of different qualitative frameworks to measure companies, a bunch of different roadmaps to try and get there. Ultimately, this is the proven success of multi-years of roadmap building, of measuring and iterating with companies. And for you, I think the important part is that you start, right? You establish a beachhead, you define what your MV star is, and you really go from there. And I wanted to share this framework with you all because if it's working for me, I think it could work for you. And I love just the open source nature of development, everyone sharing and leveraging best ideas and building on them.
So Jeremy, this is really great. Lots of different details. We've got some links here in the next slide that we'll show you guys. But how do you actually do this when the rubber meets the road? You said, we do this and we do that. We take a look at this. In your experience, who in the organization is working on these things? Is it sort of the executives, the other leaders, development teams, operations groups? Can you talk a little bit about the actual implementation of doing the work?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah, so this is the theory and the strategy, and then how do you align around this strategy? With each of our operating companies, it's different. Some are more mature and they have each of those roles. Some are less mature, and so maybe it's the engineering lead that's wearing all the hats. But what I think is important is that you kind of establish a cadence. First is baseline. So we typically have that well-architected framework assessment get done by a DevOps lead or someone who can log into AWS. They'll get that report out and they'll get a quick list of feedback, quick improvers and recommendations right there in the list that they can execute against. From there, they typically then feed that into the backlog grooming process. So the development team will say, okay, if we want to develop, let's call it 10 or 20% of our capacity to tech enablers or tech debt pay down, which of these things in the architecture framework list do we want to seed into our backlog grooming process? And from there, again, quarter after quarter, sprint after sprint, what we see is pay back and pay down of those recommendations little by little, and it gets prioritized by the engineering group. And then, of course, there's always the unintended, the unforeseen, like COVID, and maybe we have to dramatically move and optimize security or cost optimization. And so then that becomes our primary focus for a little while. But each time it's a full scoped effort of not just the DevOps or the eng lead, but really the whole engineering team looking to build aspects of each of these pillars into the development pipeline as you go.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you for that. Excellent. All right. Well, why don't we, we're just about wrapped up here. Why don't we take a look at these references just to walk you through these real quick. The first is just the overall well-architected framework. Both AWS and Azure have these concepts, kind of stole the ideas from each other. I think AWS was first and Azure adopted it as well. A couple of self-service tools, as well as some training around those tools so you can actually understand how to use them. And we'll be sending out this slide deck as well as the recording. So these will be clickable and you guys can dig into that as well. So with that, I will hand the mic back over to Marcus and we'll wrap things up.
Thanks a lot, David. Great presentation, Jeremy. Thrilled to have you on the program today. Encourage people, please keep those questions coming in. Jeremy, I'm gonna take the liberty of asking you one that I've been wondering ever since I saw this graph that you came up with. So you've got benchmarks where you're basically looking at all 30 plus of your ventures. Do you share those metrics with one another? Is it a carrot? Is it a stick? How do you use it to manage your teams?
Yeah, that's actually the unlocker in from my perspective. We use it as a carrot. So we share all these openly to all of our companies, and everyone wants to win, right? So at the end of the day, if you're kind of gamifying this, everyone's seeing these metrics. No one wants to be last in line on their MVT scores. So we use that as an incentive to, hey, maybe you should spend a little more time on your tech debt or on modernizing your processes, because at the end of the day, you're lagging the group, and everyone wants to be ahead and win in that regard. So that's actually for us been the unlockers. Don't keep these to yourself, publish these as a group, use each other to leverage best practices. And when you see someone that's outstanding in security, you know who to go help you solve that aspect of your application.
Great answer. Thank you. Steven's got a question about those quote unquote best practices. Everyone's got a different opinion about them. So can you talk a little bit about some of the specific sources for industry best practices that you use?
Yeah, I mean, it varies. Obviously, there's so many different great tools out there. I've probably got, half dozen newsletters that I watch and listen to that just come up with blog posts and new ideas. Obviously, AWS and Azure constantly innovate and have these tools, as well as experts around these tools that help extrapolate on each of these different pillars. But for me, actually, one of our best practices has been creating something we call the Office of the CTO. So creating our own group community to share best practices of what's working for one another within our portfolio. And so for us, it's actually, while all the external practices are great, it's great to stay informed, great to be see that value. Ultimately, it's what matters to your business, the size of your businesses, maturity of your businesses, and what's going to actually play. And for us, we get the most benefit from our internal community to actually drive those best practices.
And one of the follow-up questions I would have to that one, obviously, is it's technology, right? So best practices today are not necessarily best practices tomorrow. So as you've rolled out this framework, what's sort of your plan to kind of revisit them? Are you looking at them annually, twice a year? How do you anticipate updating them?
Yeah, it's interesting. Even since we rolled out this framework, the well-architected framework for both have changed the question list and have actually catered some of the questions towards SaaS or different types of software businesses. So one is like, pick the rubric that applies best for your business. And then for us, we measure, because it is a bit of a workload and it is derailing, we measure biannually, so twice a year. And we try and we also try and measure off basis when we know there's a big thing like that government rebuild. We knew there was going to be a big before and after. So that is a tool we use to help tell the story point in time of before and after when we're ready to assess it. So biannually, and then on a one-off basis as we have major initiatives, cloud migrations, rebuilds going underway.
Terrific. You mentioned in your introduction that you think that the way you think about your job is people, process, tech. I've got a question about people. What do you suggest as a best practice or metric to hire internal app dev resources or outsource the app dev for growing startups? And do you think of that metric changing as the startup grows?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say most of our companies are, sub 50 engineering team. So oftentimes they have maybe one app dev resource, but not a number yet. And so we have, what I try and do is focus on, do we have the right leaders in place first, like at the highest level, VP of Eng, Director of Eng, that can ultimately be the hiring manager and ensure success for anyone that comes next. Assuming we have that, I have a rubric or scorecard for those DevOps, app dev type resources that we know what good looks like and who's been successful in these roles and what is typically required of them. A little bit of DevSecOps knowledge, a little bit of Azure AWS workload knowledge, and cost optimization knowledge. But it does change to their point. It really changes as you scale your business and as you go from one workload to multiple workloads. We often do add-ons or aggregate businesses into our existing companies. That comes with new challenges of trying to manage now multiple workloads and multiple teams. And when we get to that stage, what got you here often won't get you there. And we have to think through evaluating and evolving that roadmap. And I try and do that predominantly through upskilling, career pathing, and just having clear guidelines for our leaders, our VPs of Eng, of how can you incentivize your team to move and shift into that role rather than try and hire new folks into the role. You're always taking lag time to do that.
Interesting question from Sarah. What role has self-led teams held in helping you achieve your goals? And I'm guessing the question behind the question is, are these teams scoring themselves, or are there leadership teams scoring them? You know, how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question. I think one of the also the underlying success plays here is the reason I picked this tool is because it is a self-service evaluation tool. And it allows your team to tell the story. So when you have a great group of self-led engineers who realize they now have a common language, a lingua franca, to talk to executives about the great work they're doing, well, they're going to go manage this whole process themselves. This wouldn't work if it's great to say one CTO managing 30 workloads. It's one CTO getting the benefit of 30 great self-led teams that have the awareness to go use a tool like this and champion the work they're doing.
Yeah, it's a great answer. You mentioned that, I know you've been working on this for some time. I think the first time you started talking about MVT was just around the time COVID started. Have you pivoted or changed your scorecard or response to MVT in response to COVID?
Yeah, it's interesting. I first landed on MVT ahead of COVID. And that's because the thing I used to say is like, this is the gold standard industry best practices. And when you're talking to executives, you don't want to say gold standard industry best practices because all they hear is money and tech cost centers. So I framed it as MVT because this is really the table stakes of what you need to be doing to sustain a software business. So it first started in that way. Now, post-COVID, I'd say I have a very different lensing on prioritization of those pillars. For example, cost optimization and operational excellence have become my two most important pieces because what happens in COVID, now you have to be able to pivot your business more. You have to run leaner and be able to adjust to different cost dynamics that are very hard to predict. And so for me, that has made maybe more of an emphasis on some of the training I'm doing around cost optimization and around operational excellence as a key priority or vector of NVT, but it hasn't changed the theory around NVT because one day we'll be past COVID and we'll still need to drive operational maturity and go off to the races again on a lot of our impaired businesses and really be able to execute on all the pillars. So I think it's just changed the lensing and the priority of execution post-COVID.
You made the decision when you rolled out MVT, 70% is the number. So what have you learned? Were you too aggressive? Were you too optimistic? What are your thoughts about 70?
Yeah, I learned I definitely sandbag and set the benchmark too low because we're already at that. 2 years in, we've now gotten almost all of our companies to that 70% benchmark, which is a testament to them. They've been just, again, outstanding leaders that are able to succeed here and drive the progress here. But ultimately, I'd like us to move higher up, like as close to 100 as we can get would be great. I'm just going to keep it at 70 because we still have, obviously companies that are in different stages of maturity. SaaS companies built 20, 30 years ago that have a lot more cruft built on over the years and a lot more work to do. And it's not fair to them to like compare them to a application stack that's new or 5 years ago and say, how come you can't get to 70 overnight? And so 70 is the right rubric for us because of the wide range of architectures and historical technical debt. But it's ultimately one that if I were managing a more modern organization, I might pick 80, 90% of best practices as probably that benchmark.
Great answer. Great answer. Love this question from Shane. For companies that are high on the MVT score, but low on engineering resources, what is your suggestion for scaling engineering teams while maintaining that high quality? Great question.
Yeah, and we have a couple in this quadrant that came in kind of new architecture, all of industry best practices, fully cloud enabled stack. And we're dealing with just this, figuring out how we can sustain that high NVT score while growing the business. And I think for me, it goes back to people again. Oftentimes, the thing that's probably lacking in an organization dynamic like that is their processes we're kind of, tinker architects, everyone's doing really great stuff, but they're all doing it in isolation. And so what we start to focus on is in the process pillar of the people process tech. How do we mature the processes such that we can grow to teams of teams, or use the Spotify model of development, and really still sustain the same quality of output and the same operational excellence. And for that, I go back to like what gets measured gets improved. So setting your KPIs and benchmarks for both your engineering efforts as well as your engineering outputs, the workload of the team, and continuing to measure that as you change the organizational dynamics and the process dynamics, I allow you to stay true to MVT. And it's an offshoot of MVT. So that's where, really this is one metric. You need to pair it with the other metrics, engineering efficiency and infrastructure metrics that help tell the whole story. But it's a good question, and one that's, a constant challenge for me as well.
Super strategic presentation, very much about working on the business. Unfortunately, a lot of us spend a lot of time working in the business. So within your own ventures, how do you balance the prioritization of MVT backlog items with the usual demand for new features from product teams or sales teams? The customer needs this right now. How do you do that?
Yeah, that's the constant struggle, I think, of any engineering team. We'd all love to be building new cool stuff and enriching what we're doing. But at the end of the day, it's a business, and we need to sustain the first order principles of the business, which is building to product output, building to new customers, and scaling the business. How I like to do that is at least have an upfront agreement, alignment with your product and engineering teams and your executives on the split effort. Like, let's call it 70% is going to be built towards new product iteration and feature iteration, and 30% is going to be the other group, which is usually tech debt enablement, or tech debt pay down, product enablement, or engineering enablement, and maybe defect management. But if you're at least coordinating off a section of the engineering team's time and effort every sprint to addressing some of these things, you are continuing to increment and improve on that MVT score. And so for us, that's how we do it, is we try and get alignment agreement to the percent workload to spend on this, and guard that so that we can continue to make improvements. And when we forget to do that, and that happens, like we just have to ramp on product, we got big pushes, well, you start to slip in your ranking in MVT compared to the portfolio, and you can go back and point to your executive, hey, we agreed to slip on this for a while, but we're here now, and the rest of our portfolio's over here, so we should continue to double down now to pick back up pace on MVT. So for us, it's always a negotiation, and I totally get that. I'm never going to push for this over everything else we're doing in our businesses.
I think a great question that a lot of startup entrepreneurs might have is, so when can I really be looking at these best practices? We got a great comment from Bill that he sees a lot of companies that are incurring tech debt by working in silos on their product in the early stages, and goodness gracious, if you make a wrong decision, suddenly you realize, wow, that 70% is going to be really hard to tackle. So at what point could a venture really be taking a look at this framework, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's this old adage, there are two types of software companies, one with a mountain of tech debt and the other that are out of business. And so you're always going to have technical debt. And if you don't have technical debt when you launched, you waited too long to launch. And so for us, we always think of this as a baseline that comes after we've had good product market fit and we've had a lot of things established. And so even when you saw that government rebuild, this wasn't the priority. It was like, let's get an MVP, let's get a paying customer to incentivize the build out. Then let's build, as we're thinking through this rebuild, make sure we're doing it properly such that we can start to rapidly improve that MVT score. And so for us, it's always going to be the second tier effect of, okay, we found something that works. Now what? Now we got to actually make sure it's sustainable for the long term. And we have industry best practices that allow us to pivot and iterate on this product in such a way that will keep us competitive.
Outstanding. I'm going to warn our audience. I'm going to say the next question is the last question, but that doesn't mean that the window's closed. Feel free to submit some more here, because it's not often we have a great speaker like Jeremy. Jeremy, I know you've mentioned that you've looked at a couple different ways to quantify qualitative frameworks. What are some of the biggest roadblocks that you came across in your efforts to do this? I can tell you put a lot of thought into it. What were some of your ideas or frameworks that ended up on the cutting room floor, and why did that happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think early on, I tried to oversimplify, like, what's the red, yellow, green of all these different pillars, and how can we just have a like heat map of success? The problem was that, again, was subjective. It was my subjective red, yellow, green, and my subjective recommendations of improvers. It wasn't an industry standard that we could point to say, okay, no matter where we are, we think we are, here is the industry benchmark, and here's where our competitors are striving to get to. So how do we even the playing field and look at a holistic measurement that is not just our subjective view of good or bad, but is I trust the very bright minds at AWS and architects who came up with this framework that this is the gold standard, or this is the industry standard for these type of benchmarks. So first was did a lot of subjective, qualitative, like red, yellow, greens, and my own heat maps and my own recommendation lists. And I had the privilege of getting to look at a lot of companies and getting a lot of signals of those things, but it wasn't true. It was still just my subjective opinion. So I had to ditch that and realize I could possibly be wrong in my own read of these things. And then take a step back and look if there's something else out there. We have this saying at ASG, how can you stand on the shoulders of giants? Use what's been done before to extend and improve on that. And that is what I think we try to do here, is really just see what's out there, see what's really working for a collective group in the industry, and then improve on that thinking.
Standing on the shoulders of giants. I think that's a great point to cut it off. Looks like we have answered all of the questions from today's attendees. Thank you all again for attending today's webinar and participating with such great questions. As you know, you'll receive an email with a link to today's recording and slide deck. I want to thank Jeremy and Dave for sharing your time with us today. I don't know about you, but I certainly learned a lot in this webinar. Jeremy and Dave, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks a lot, guys. See ya.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks again, Jeremy. Take care. Thank you, everyone.